All right, so today, let's really get into it with the history of Britain, but not the usual, kings and queens kind of stuff. What if I told you that the United Kingdom wasn't so united? Like, what if its identity came from, well, brutal conflict rather than treaties and all that?
Hmm. It really makes you think, right? I mean, we usually picture history as this neat timeline, but it's actually way messier.
Right.
Simon Schama, in his book A History of Britain, Volume 2, The British Wars, 1603 to 1776, really dives into those messy conflicts. It's amazing how much they shaped Britain as we know it.
It's more than just battles and wars, too, right? Sama says that these wars, ripped apart the very fabric of society. And those scars are still around today.
Oh, absolutely. One of the most interesting things he says is that those early maps of Great Britain were kind of more like wishful thinking than accurate. They showed unity, but things on the ground were totally different.
So what was Britain really like back then? Just a bunch of groups fighting.
It was more like a patchwork of communities that were seriously divided. Even within the same country, like England, you had industry clashing with rural life. In Scotland, you had lowlanders versus highlanders. And then there's the constant back and forth between Catholics and Protestants.
That sounds like a disaster just waiting to happen. How did they ever come together as a single nation?
It's kind of a paradox. Schama thinks that Britain was forged through these brutal conflicts. He calls it a baptism of blood.
But how can all that violence and division lead to unity? Seems kind of backwards.
Well, it's complicated, but think of it this way. When there's conflict, people are forced to face their differences. They have to compromise and find common ground somehow. But it wasn't always peaceful, obviously.
Definitely not. Schama doesn't hold back on how awful these conflicts were. He talks about the English Civil War as a total societal breakdown. Massacres, disease, families ripped apart because they were on opposite sides. It's hard to even imagine the trauma.
He really paints a picture of how bad it was. For instance, there's this story about Lady Jordan during the siege of Cirencester. She was so terrified that she basically went back to being a child mentally.
Oh, wow. That's just awful. It makes you realize that these weren't just things in a history book. They were real events that changed countless lives.
Yeah, and those experiences echo through the generations. They shape cultures and national identities in ways we don't even realize.
So how did things get so bad? Where did all this conflict come from?
Summa traces it back to James I, the first king to rule both England and Scotland. James wanted a harmonious union, but when he tried to force it, especially with religion, it blew up in his face.
Sounds like he underestimated how deep these divisions were. He thought he could just make them disappear with a wave of his hand.
His son, Charles I, inherited the throne and his father's dream of unity. Sadly, he didn't have the political skills to handle the, increasingly complicated religious and political scene.
And speaking of Charles I, wasn't there some drama about a Spanish marriage proposal?
Oh yeah, almost a disaster. James nearly started a religious war just by trying to marry Charles to a Spanish princess. It really shows how volatile the whole religion and politics mix was back then.
I can't imagine how tense things were in the royal court. So was it really about love or more like strategy?
Let's just say that love wasn't really a factor. James wanted the marriage for alliances and religious unity, but he really misjudged how the public would feel.
And then there's Cromwell. He went from being some nobody landowner to one of the most powerful figures in British history. What a story.
His story is incredible. He started as a devout Puritan, pretty unknown in Parliament, but his conviction and military genius put him front and center in the conflict.
So you have these simmering tensions, a king obsessed with unity, and figures like Cromwell challenging the status quo. It sounds like a recipe for a major explosion.
And that's exactly what we'll be looking at next time. We'll get into what caused the English Civil War, the clash of beliefs, and the people who shaped this turning point in British history.
Last time, we were talking about Britain right before the Civil War. Everyone was so tense, ready to fight. Reading Schama, you can practically feel this storm coming.
Yeah, it's really intense. Charles I, he was all about this divine right stuff.
Right.
And his advisors just kept telling him he had absolute power as king. But then you have Parliament getting more and more bold, wanting a say in how the country's run.
Seems like a huge clash, like different ways of seeing the world, tradition and the king's power from God versus this new idea that the people have the power.
Exactly. And this wasn't just some theory. It affected how the country was actually run. Like, Charles tried to get money without asking Parliament.
Really?
He brought back these old feudal laws, forced people to give him loans, even started selling monopolies. People saw this as totally unfair, like a tyrant. Things got even worse.
It's like he wanted to fight Was he really that clueless about what people were feeling?
Well, Schama thinks Charles's upbringing had a lot to do with it. He was surrounded by people who believed in absolute monarchy, like William Laud.
Oh, Lord, the Archbishop of Canterbury, right? He was obsessed with fixing up churches. Even went crazy trying to find the original medieval tiles.
Right. Laud was all about high Anglicanism, the rituals and ceremonies, you know. He wanted everyone to worship in this very specific, elaborate way. But lots of people, especially the Puritans, saw it as a step back towards Catholicism.
Wow. It's crazy how even something like the design of a church could cause such a big conflict.
Yeah.
It shows how much these religious differences really mattered.
For sure. Religion and politics were completely mixed up in those days. It wasn't just about what you believed personally, it was about who had power and how society was structured.
Right. And then you have people like John Wallington, that Puritan craftsman we mentioned before.
Mm.
For him, it was like a battle between good and evil, like England was fighting the Antichrist.
His diary is amazing. He wrote down everything, but he saw it all through this Puritan lens. People like Prynne, Burton, and Bastwick, those guys who got locked up for criticizing the church, they were heroes to him, martyrs fighting for the true faith. That kind of religious passion really fueled the opposition to Charles and pushed for change.
So, okay, you've got all this tension, religious and political, a king who seems to want to make things worse. So what finally started the war? What was the last straw?
There are a few things that really pushed things over the edge. Charles tried to force a new prayer book on the Scottish church.
Didn't go over well, did it?
Not at all. It led to a rebellion in Scotland. He needed money to fight them, so he had to call Parliament back after 11 years.
Talk about walking into a trap. That couldn't have gone well.
Nope, total disaster. Parliament didn't give him money. They just used the chance to complain about everything. They wanted changes, limits on the king's power, even talked about impeaching Laud.
And then Charles tried to get rid of Parliament again. That seems pretty desperate.
It was, and it backfired big time. The country was totally split, and both sides started getting ready to fight.
And that's when the war really started to affect everyday people, right? Families torn apart, communities divided, years of violence and bloodshed.
Yeah, Schama tells the story of the Verney family. Sir Edmund, the father, was a strong royalist, but his son, Ralph, was a Puritan who sided with Parliament. Their letters show how heartbreaking it was to have a family divided by war.
To choose between your loyalty to the king and your own son? I can't even imagine.
It wasn't just families either. Whole communities were pulled into the conflict. Schama talks about Lady Brilliana Harley, a Puritan woman who was totally isolated and threatened in her own home because everyone around her was a royalist.
It really shows how this war was everywhere, in every part of life.
Right, and as the fighting went on, a new leader emerged. Someone who would change everything. Oliver Cromwell.
Cromwell. He's such a complicated guy. Was he a good guy, a bad guy, or somewhere in between?
That's the question, isn't it? He was a brilliant military leader, that's for sure. He took Parliament's army, which was basically a mess, and turned them into a powerful fighting force.
And he was a really devout Puritan too, right?
Absolutely. His faith was everything to him. He believed God was on his side. That conviction inspired both his followers and the people fighting against him.
So how did this farmer become so powerful? What was it about Cromwell that made him so successful? We left off with Cromwell like this military leader driven by his Puritan beliefs. So once he won, how did he actually rule? Did he create the England that everyone who fought with him wanted?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it? Winning battles was one thing, but Cromwell had to rebuild England. The country was divided, and a lot of people still wanted a king. Imagine trying to rebuild a nation when people don't even agree on what it should be.
So what was Cromwell's England actually like? Was it that Puritan utopia he'd talked about?
It was a mix, really. Part practical, part idealistic. He got rid of Parliament when they challenged him, put in strict rules about how people should behave, and crushed any rebellions. That included royalists who still supported the king, and groups like the Levelers who thought Cromwell wasn't radical enough.
The Levelers? What do they want?
Oh, they were interesting. They were like the revolutionaries who thought the revolution hadn't gone far enough. They wanted everyone to be able to vote, not just men who owned property. More religious freedom, a fairer legal system, but Cromwell saw them as a threat to his power, especially while he was still trying to get things under control.
It's a tough situation, right? How much change is too much? When does a revolution become a different kind of tyranny?
Exactly. Cromwell had to balance things carefully. He had to keep order and stop the country from falling apart, but he also wanted to build this godly society.
And what about the people who still supported the monarchy? Were they just quiet?
Not a chance. Charles II, the king's heir, was in exile, but he was busy getting support. He had loyalists all over England and Scotland just waiting for a chance to come back. In fact, Scotland had already crowned Charles II as their king. They were openly defying Cromwell.
So Cromwell had these internal pressures, external threats from the exiled king, and Scotland basically saying no to him. How did he handle all that?
Well, it was a combination of military power, political strategy, and probably some luck, too. He knew how to make allies when he needed to, but he was also ruthless in crushing his enemies. But it wasn't peaceful. The damage from the Civil War was still there, and lots of people saw him as illegitimate, not a real ruler.
And then there's Ireland. Schama doesn't shy away from how bad Cromwell's campaign there was. It's full of massacres and revenge.
It's a reminder that even people who fight for freedom can do terrible things. Cromwell saw the Irish Rebellion as a threat to English power, to Protestants controlling things. He responded with incredible violence. The siege of Drogheda, where they killed tons of civilians and soldiers, is a really dark part of his legacy.
It's hard to believe that this is the same guy who wanted religious freedom in England. How do historians explain that?
It's complicated. You have to look at the history between England and Ireland, all the hatred and religious tension. Cromwell honestly believed God wanted him to punish the Irish, who he saw as rebels and heretics. That doesn't make it okay, but it helps us understand why he did what he did.
So what happened to Cromwell's republic? Did it change England?
For a while, yes. He brought some stability and created his version of a godly society, even if he had to be harsh. But it didn't last. After he died in 1658, his son Richard tried to take over, but he just wasn't strong enough. The republic fell apart, and a few years later, Charles II was invited back to be king. The monarchy was restored.
So everything went back to the way it was? All that fighting, all the change, for nothing?
Not really. Those British wars changed the country forever. The monarchy might have come back, but it was different. All those debates and fights about limited government, individual rights, and religious tolerance, they laid the foundation for the constitutional monarchy that Britain would become.
So those conflicts that Schama talks about, they weren't just about destruction, they were also the start of something new.
Exactly, and that's why history is so interesting. It's not just about dates and names, it's about seeing how the past creates the present and how we're still affected by it today.
It makes you question everything you thought you knew about history, right? It's not just a straight line from one thing to the next. It's messy and full of choices and consequences that no one could have predicted.
I agree. And Schama does a great job of explaining all of that, connecting the past to the present. If you want to learn more about this period, you should really check out A History of Britain, Volume 2, The British Wars, 1603 to 1776. We'll put a link in the show notes.
Well, that's it for our deep dive into Schama's British Wars. It's been a wild ride through some of the most chaotic and important times in British history. We hope you've learned something new about how this country, with all its quirks and contradictions, came to be.
And we hope it's made you curious to learn more about history, both the good and the bad. There's always more to explore, more questions to ask, and more to understand.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Make sure to subscribe to the podcast and tell your friends about this episode if you think they'd enjoy this journey through British history as much as we did.
Until next time, keep exploring.